change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we left Paul at the Antonia Fortress barricade, bound to be scourged, to find out what caused the Jews to be so upset to riot. Where the first riot was by Paul being falsely accused by bringing a Gentile into the temple. Where the second was caused by Paul just saying the word Gentile. And the thing that's disappointing here is that we don't hear of anyone coming from the Jerusalem church to help the Apostle Paul. And so this commander here, whose name is Claudius Lysias, whose real name is Lysias, but because he was appointed by Claudius, he took Claudius's name to honor him. But here, after the commander finds out that Paul's a Roman citizen, he needs to find out what the official charges are going to be to charge Paul, because that's Paul's right as a Roman citizen. And he needed to let the officials know the charges, where Lysias here is at the assumption that Paul has done something very treacherous. Because why else would that whole crowd be chanting for Paul's death, yelling, "Away with this man. He's not fit to live." And having no charges and not knowing exactly what happened, because Lysias, he doesn't speak Aramaic, he sets up this special meeting with the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, which would be the 70 most powerful men in Israel. And this would include the high priest Ananias, who would be proceeding over the council. And it's not like they all volunteered to come. They were commanded to appear. And so Paul, he's loosed from his bonds and he's brought before the council under guard with the commander who's watching and he's listening to see if Paul has violated any Roman law. But this isn't the normal place that the Sanhedrin meets. They usually meet in this place called the Chamber of Hewn Stones. But the reason they're meeting here is because the Romans, they couldn't meet with them there because Gentiles are not allowed in there. And so as Paul addresses them, he speaks to them as equals, where he calls them men and brethren. He doesn't call them fathers, that he's under them. And the reason is because Paul, he was one of them. He, at one time, was a voting member of the Sanhedrin before he became a Christian. And so here, Paul, he's probably very excited to speak to them because he's probably thinking that he's going to get a second chance to be able to win them from Christ, to be able to preach Jesus to these powerful men of Israel. Because he didn't get a chance to finish his message to them because of the riot. Because you have to realize, Paul, he doesn't hate these men. He loves them. They're his brothers, where he's just like them. He's one of them. And Paul, he only gets one sentence out. "I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day," where that is all that he had spoken so far. And all he's claiming here is that he's innocent and that he's a good Jew and he hasn't broken the law. And Ananias, the high priest, he gives some kind of nod or some kind of signal to whoever's close to Paul to punch him in the mouth, which is a violation of the Mosaic law. And they all know it's a violation of the law because it's written in Deuteronomy 25:1, which says that only a man who's found guilty can be beaten. Where Paul here, he hasn't been found guilty of anything. And here we hear the word conscience, which is one of Paul's favorite words, where he uses it like 21 times in all of his writings. And he uses it here, and he uses it again in chapter 24, besides being in his letters. But he's not saying by conscience that he's perfect. He's just saying that he's not aware of anything that he's done against God, that his conscience is clean. But Paul's claim here, it wasn't received very well, and it angered the high priest. And so Paul, he realizes he's not going to get a fair hearing before Ananias. And history, it paints Ananias as this very violent, very corrupt man, and a very greedy man, where Josephus, the historian, he tells us that he stole tithes from the common priests and that he would do anything to increase his authority, where it was said that he cared more for Rome's favor than Israel's welfare, that he was in the pocket of Rome. And in 66 AD, which is actually not very many years from this point, when the Jews actually revolted against Rome, Ananias had to flee for his life. And then these nationalist Jews, they find Ananias hiding inside of Herod's aqueduct outside the palace, and that's where they killed him. So now with Paul being punched in the face, he's outraged, and he immediately reacts and he blurts out, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." And then he says, "For you sit to judge me according to the law, and you command me to be struck contrary to the law." Because this is supposed to be an open hearing. This is where they're supposed to be able to get to the truth. And here, Paul, he's being struck by who is supposed to be religious men. These are the people who are supposed to be representing the God of the Bible, where this is total hypocrisy, and they're doing it all openly. But this is where all the facts are to be carefully extracted to find out facts of the case. And so with this being the conduct of the Sanhedrin, he probably can't believe that even these members would obey such a command. Where Paul, he's calling this man who had him struck a whitewashed wall, and what he's calling him a hypocrite. And what he's referring to is how they would whitewash the tombstones. They would whitewash them so they'd be easy to identify, so that nobody would walk on them or come into contact with them. Because any contact with any type of dead body would make a person ceremonially unclean. So these tombs, they would look all clean and white, and so they'd be pretty on the outside, but they're all filled with death. They're filled with corruption. They're all rotting on the inside. But nobody here is concerned that they violated the law. All they're concerned about is Paul and his reviling of the high priest, where they rebuke Paul. And Paul, after hearing that the man who ordered him struck was the high priest, he apologized right away. And it's not because the man was right, but that he realizes that he himself violated the law without knowing that he did. But we see when he finds out, he immediately admits his fault, and he actually recites the law that he broke. Exodus 22:28. You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Where some people, they look at this and they think Paul's being sarcastic here. But I don't really think so. I believe Paul, he really didn't know that Ananias was the high priest. And part of the reason would be that this is in an informal setting. It's not the normal setting for the Sanhedrin. So the high priest, he may not have been wearing his official robes. And you have to realize it's been about 25 years since Paul has been in this kind of an environment. And high priests, they change every so often. And this Ananias, he is not the same man as the high priest Annas, the one we know of from Jesus' trial. And you got to remember, Paul, he had poor eyesight. So there's a lot of reasons that Paul, honestly, that he may not have known that Ananias was the high priest. But when he found out, although he doesn't respect the man, Paul, he immediately apologizes, respecting the office of the high priest, which is how we're supposed to be. We might not always agree with our leaders or respect their views or their decisions, but we are to respect their office, like we're supposed to respect law enforcement and teachers, or else we end up living in anarchy, and where we have mob justice, where the mob rules, where might makes right. All right, and so here in this next part, I really like this, because to me, This shows me that Paul, he wasn't just intellectually smart, but that he could think on his feet, that he's street smart, where he sees the situation he's in, and so he's going to take the focus off himself and put it on something else. Rebecca's really good at this. All my kids are really good at this, where now Paul, he cries out, he says, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and the resurrection of the dead. I am being judged. Where he uses this situation to divide his enemy by playing the Pharisees against the Sadducees. And there are some people who teach this passage, and they're much more gracious with Paul than I am, where they hold Paul at a higher standard, where they say he only has the best intentions here. And I would actually say that they're probably right to do so. But these guys, they don't see this as a trick in any way, where Paul, he's only bringing up the resurrection because he's only wanting to preach the resurrection to these men. And so to them, he'd be preaching the same thing that he's been preaching in all the synagogues about Jesus and the resurrection, where they think that Paul wouldn't have that kind of lack of integrity to play such a cheap trick. But I don't totally agree with them, because it does say here that Paul, that he surveyed the room and that he knows that this group is divided over the resurrection and that he belongs to the group that believes in a resurrection, which is the Pharisees. And I believe that Paul here, he's looking for allies. And the resurrection was what these guys always fought about. They would never agree. Where the Sadducees, they only believe in the first 5 books of Moses. They don't believe in any of the prophets or any of the books of the prophets that they're scripture. They only believe in the things that they can see. So they don't believe in spirits, they don't believe in angels or miracles, and they don't believe in the resurrection. Where the Pharisees, they believe all those things. So Paul, he identifies himself as a Pharisee, as being one of these men, and he says the whole reason he's here is because he's a Pharisee and he believes in a resurrection, where I believe he's trying to take that focus off himself. Because if you remember, what started the riot wasn't Paul mentioning the resurrection. It was Paul mentioning going to the Gentiles. And so now Paul, he causes another riot, and it happens right in front of the commander, Lysias again, where now the Sanhedrin, they're going to tear Paul apart. And then you can hear the Pharisees that they're mocking the Sadducees here, where they're now identifying themselves with Paul, and they're saying things, well, maybe an angel told him, because Sadducees, they don't believe in angels either. And I personally, I would never blame Paul for using this kind of tactic. I just think it's smart, because they struck him and he was never going to get a fair hearing in front of these men. And so now what happens here is that the commander, he's not going to let his prisoner, Paul, who's a Roman citizen, be pulled apart by this group of men having this internal fight. And so again, the soldiers, they're brought in, and where they're again pulling Paul out by force and bringing him back to the barracks. And so Paul, back in custody, and he's probably feeling like a failure because he now hasn't been able to reach his people, the Jews, and now it's these 2 times. But the Lord, he's not going to let Paul feel like that very long, because it says that the next night that Jesus comes to him and stands by him in the night, where Jesus says, be of good cheer, which really doesn't mean, hey, Paul, you ought to feel really happy about this. But what be of good cheer means, it means to take courage, where this is the same thing that Jesus said 5 times in the New Testament. He said it 4 times in the Gospels, where during Jesus's earthly ministry in Matthew in chapter 9, he used it twice. He used it once with that paralytic man before he healed him, where he said, your sins are forgiven, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven. And then he said it to that woman with the flow of blood, and that was after she was healed, but she thought she was in trouble for touching Jesus, and he told her to be of good cheer, to take courage, and because she thought she was stealing a healing. And that's also what Jesus said to the disciples during the storm on the sea in Matthew 14. And then he again said it to the disciples in the upper room in John 16 when they thought Jesus was a ghost. And he says, be of good cheer. So be of good cheer. Every time it's used, it means take courage. And here with Paul, he's telling Paul to be brave, where Jesus is telling him that he did a good job testifying of him before the Jews, and that Paul, he's now going to do the same thing for him again in Rome. And so Jesus telling Paul to be of good cheer, it never means that Paul, that he wasn't going to face any more trials, but that Jesus, that he would sustain him through these trials. And John told you this morning that me and him, we just got back from that East Coast Pastors Conference, where we heard this great testimony from Mike McClure, who's Don McClure's son, the pastor of Calvary Chapel, San Jose, where the church that Mike pastors, they ranked up fines from the county of Santa Clara for around $5 million. And it was all for not shutting down the church during the COVID crisis. And when I heard him, I really didn't know how he would be able to handle this. I couldn't have. And I believe that Jesus here was telling Mike to be of good cheer, to keep going, because it seemed like everything was against him. But when you hear Mike speak about this, and he speaks about all the fruit that this trial has produced, that it ended in thousands of people coming to the Lord and hundreds of people being baptized, where all of it was caused because of this persecution, where before this, his church only had about 250 people attending, though their building could seat around 2,000 people. And now this church is full, and the mayor of San Jose, he now attends this church, and the district attorneys that were prosecuting him, a couple of them are now listening to him, and many of them had themselves removed from his case. And it was all because of Mike's testimony before them, where Mike was standing for Jesus in the midst of these trials. And Mike says that if that persecution didn't come, and Mike was really clear, that there would have been very little to no fruit at his church. And so if you ever get the time, you should maybe look up that pastor's conference and listen to Mike's testimony there. But the next thing that we see here is that Paul, that he needs to take courage because there's these 40 Jewish assassins who have all placed themselves under a vow, meaning that they're going to have this hunger strike and not eat or drink anything until he's dead. And they're all coming for Paul. And there was this secret group of Jewish assassins who they usually targeted Romans or those who supported Romans, and they were called the Daggermen. And now they're seeing Paul here as an enemy to the Jews. And so to accomplish this ambush on Paul, they're asking the chief priests and the elders to lie to the Romans. And they said, tell him that you have more questions for Paul, asking him to bring Paul by again tomorrow. And they said, we'll kill him on the way down. And you see here that the Sanhedrin and the priests, they don't have any problem with lying or conspiring with assassins to commit murder. And then we find out that Paul, he has a sister. We didn't know he had a sister, and that this sister, she has a son. And they both are living in Jerusalem. And they're probably not Christians. They're probably both Jews. And we don't know really how they found out about this ambush. But it's really possible that Paul's sister's husband, that he probably was a Pharisee, because that would make sense. His father's a Pharisee. So this is like a family of Pharisees. It's a Pharisee family. And her son, he maybe went to school there. Maybe he's at the same school Paul went to with Gamaliel. But somewhere, somebody talked. And somehow, this family is connected to the Pharisees and to the Sanhedrin. And even though they're not Christians, they know that this is evil. And she knows her brother Paul, that she knows he's a good man. And we don't know how old Paul's nephew is here, but this word that's used for a young man here, it can also be used for a boy. And so he comes to his uncle Paul and he tells him about the conspiracy. And then Paul, he sends his nephew to the commander, Lysias, where Lysias, he takes Paul's nephew by the hand, which means that he probably was a younger boy, because that was common for an older man to take a younger boy by the hand, to take him in private. And then Lysias tells the boy not to tell anyone that he told him of the Jews' plot. And then right away, Lysias, he gathers 470 men. So it's 2 centurions with their 200 soldiers, and then an extra 200 spearsmen and 70 horsemen, which would probably be about half of all the men in the Antonia fortress. And so now at 9 o'clock, which would have been that 3rd hour of the night, they provide Paul with horses to ride, and they start this all-night march to Antipatris, which is 37 miles away. And then when they get there, the danger has passed. And so the cavalry and 200 men, they return to Jerusalem, where the rest of them, they finish the final 27 miles to Caesarea, where Paul is officially handed off with a letter from the commander, where in this commander's letter, he kind of leaves out a couple of the facts, some of the details, because he kind of left out that he bound Paul and that he really didn't initially think that Paul was a Roman, but he thought he was an Egyptian. He left that out, and he left out the part where he almost scourged him. Where Lysias here, he kind of makes himself out to be more of a hero. He makes it sound like he learned that Paul was a citizen of Rome right away, and that's why he saved him. But what's important here about this letter is that the commander, he didn't charge Paul, that he didn't find Paul guilty of anything, especially nothing worthy of death, which shows that there was no charges of subversion or anything that could be pinned on the Christian movement in respect to Roman law. So Paul, he didn't break Roman law. And you might wonder here, well, what happened to those 40 assassins? Did they all get really skinny, and did they all die of starvation? And the answer is probably no, because there's always a technical way to get out of a vow that you can't fulfill. All right, so now here up in Caesarea, this begins Paul's 2-year confinement at the palace, where after this, he will spend 2 more years confined in Rome. And if you add all of this up with all the travel that Paul will have to do, Paul will be in Roman custody for about 5 years. But here, Paul, he's not put into the common prison, but he's kept in custody at the palace, which is the governor's official residence. And this was built by Herod the Great. But it's kind of not like he can walk around the palace freely like he lives there. But this is a lot better than the common prison, because here, Paul, he'll have more freedom where he can see his friends, and they'll be able to provide for him. And so now we start chapter 24, and Paul, he's now been at the palace for 5 days. And the high priest Ananias, he comes down, which is that same guy that hit Paul in the mouth along with the elders. And they bring with him an orator named Tertullus. And an orator is someone who's very skilled at speaking. But what he really is he's a skilled attorney. And he's a Hellenistic Jew, and he's the very best that money can buy, because the high priest, along with all these other priests that run the temple, they're all extremely rich. They're all millionaires. And this man, he's the best in his field.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,